Get that dog away from the bed now! Dr. Linda Ashford's voice sliced through the sterile silence like a scalpel. It was 2:07 a.m. in room 6 of Dallas Children's Medical Center when chaos exploded. The heart monitor screamed, nurses scrambled, and 100 questions hung in the air like smoke after a fire. But none of that compared to the sight of the 95-pound German Shepherd, Ranger, clamping his powerful jaws onto the metal rail of the hospital bed, growling like a beast possessed. His handler, Mike Ramirez, a seasoned ex-military K-9 officer, shouted commands that fell on deaf ears. Ranger wasn't listening. The dog's eyes were locked on the motionless form of 8-year-old Noah Bennett, tubes snaking in and out of the boy's fragile body. And then the machine flatlined. Gasps filled the room. Nurses lunged for the crash cart. Dr. Ashford's hands hovered in hesitation. But Ranger didn't hesitate. He had known something was wrong. Before the machines did, before the humans did, before anyone. To understand how a therapy dog biting a hospital bed saved a boy's life, you need to start from the beginning. When Ranger did something no one expected, he refused to obey. Noah Bennett had been in a coma for 10 days. The accident on I-20 had turned a normal Texas Saturday into a living nightmare. A distracted driver ran a red light, T-boned the family's SUV, and flipped it twice. Brian Bennett, a reliable salt-of-the-earth mechanic, walked away with bruises. Emily, Noah's mother, a 4th-grade teacher, broke her wrist, but Noah didn't move. He hadn't moved since. Room 6 in the pediatric ICU had become a second home for the Bennetts. The walls were decorated with hand-drawn dinosaurs from Noah's classmates. A plastic stegosaurus stood guard over the nightstand, and the overhead lights were dimmed to keep the mood from feeling like a morgue. Emily sat in a corner chair, her hand cradling Noah's limp fingers, reading Jurassic Park aloud every afternoon. Brian, stoic and sleepless, made endless rounds between the hospital cafeteria and vending machines. They were united in grief, but barely hanging on. Enter Ranger. At 5 years old, Ranger was already a legend. He'd served with Mike in California wildfire rescues, sniffing through collapsed buildings, pulling survivors from impossible places. Now, retired and retrained as a therapy dog, he brought comfort to sick children at Dallas Children's 3 times a week. Ranger wasn't just good at it, he was extraordinary. Nurses said he had a 6th sense. Some kids hadn't smiled in days until Ranger rested his head on their beds. That Tuesday morning, Ranger padded calmly down the hallway, of the 3rd floor, tail wagging, nails clicking against the tile. Mike guided him from room to room, pausing to let children pet his thick fur, whisper secrets into his ears, or just smile for the first time in weeks. Everything was routine until room 6. Ranger stopped at the doorway, his ears shooting up, head tilting slightly. Mike tugged gently on the leash. "Ranger, visit," he said, using the cue the dog had responded to 100 times before. But Ranger didn't move. He stood frozen, eyes locked on Noah. Mike frowned. "That's strange," he muttered, tugging again. Then a voice from behind startled him. "Wait, I know that dog." Emily Bennett stood, voice raw from exhaustion. Her eyes widened with sudden recognition. Came to Noah's school back in April. They did a K-9 safety demo. Noah talked about him for days. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through photos. Then she found it, a picture of Noah beaming with joy, arms wrapped around Ranger's neck, a sticker on his chest that read, "Future Hero." Mike studied the photo, heart tightening. "Maybe he remembers him," Emily whispered. Ranger took a step forward, then another, slowly approaching the bed like a soldier entering a minefield. He pressed his nose gently to Noah's hand. A soft whine escaped him. From that moment on, Ranger changed. Over the next few days, Ranger's behavior around room 6 became more intense. During other therapy visits, he was calm and affectionate. But as soon as they neared Noah's room, the dog pulled hard on the leash, growled softly, and sat stiffly by the boy's bed. "He's never acted like this," Mike told Nurse Caitlin Ross one afternoon as they watched Ranger staring intently at Noah's chest. Caitlin nodded. My grandmother used to say dogs could sense sickness before doctors could. She paused. Sometimes I think she was right. Inside room 6, the machines showed no changes, no signs of waking, just the usual coma readings, steady, dull, unchanging. But Ranger kept watching. He stopped eating, ignored his treats, wouldn't play. At night, he scratched at Mike's front door trying to get back to the hospital. Mike, a man who had pulled people from collapsed houses and led dogs into fires, was shaken. He'd seen dogs act on instinct before. But this was personal. If you believe in the power of animals and stories that restore your faith in the impossible, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heroes for Animals. Because some heroes walk on 4 legs. That Friday at 2:38 a.m., everything came to a head. Security cameras later showed what happened. Ranger was asleep in room 6 next to Noah's bed under special permission. Mike had been granted one final night before the therapy program was suspended due to Ranger's disruptive behavior. That's when it started. Ranger stood up abruptly, ears alert. He sniffed the air, then climbed halfway onto the bed, something he had never done before. He began whining, pawing softly at the IV stand. Then he let out a single guttural bark, and another. Then the heart monitor wavered. Dr. Ashford rushed in, followed by Caitlin and 2 other nurses. Everyone shouted at once, but Ranger wasn't moving. Instead, he turned, latched onto the bed rail with his teeth, and bit down. He growled, tugged, barked again. Absolute chaos, until the alarm sounded. Noah's oxygen level dropped. The ventilator showed a pressure loss. Caitlin's eyes snapped to the readings. The breathing tube, something's wrong. Ranger stood directly over the ventilator hose. His growls grew frantic. Caitlin dove in, examining the connection. Oh my God, she whispered. It's loose, it's barely connected. They fixed it just in time. Minutes later, the room quieted. Noah's vitals stabilized. Everyone looked at the dog. He just sat there, watching the boy he hadn't given up on. The hospital called it a mechanical failure. That's what ended up in the incident report. They didn't mention the German shepherd who sounded the alarm at 2:38 a.m. They didn't say anything about the tube that almost came loose, until a dog with war zone instincts stepped in and saved a child's life. Mike Ramirez knew what he saw, and so did Emily Bennett. But by noon the next day, Ranger had been suspended from the hospital's therapy program. Mike stood in Administrator Linda Crowley's corner office on the 9th floor. The view of downtown Dallas glared behind her like judgment. I'm not here to argue, she said, adjusting the cuff of her perfectly tailored blazer. But I am responsible for every patient and staff member in this building. With respect, Mike replied, jaw tight. My dog saved a boy's life last night. Linda didn't blink. Your dog bit hospital property. He caused a disturbance in the ICU. The fact that it coincided with a medical emergency doesn't change the fact that he acted unpredictably. Mike shook his head, trying to keep his cool. He didn't act out. He responded to something none of us saw coming. The machines didn't detect it, she countered. No vital changes, no alerts. We can't base medical protocols on canine behavior. Mike left without another word. But deep down he knew something the machines didn't. Ranger was working. He hadn't stopped being a rescue dog. He just switched mission types, and Noah. Bennett wasn't just another patient, not to him. That evening, Ranger lay on the hardwood floor of Mike's small North Dallas home, curled around a crumpled blue t-shirt. Noah's. Mike had brought it back from the hospital. Emily had handed it to him with tearful eyes and said, maybe it'll help him eat. But Ranger didn't touch his food. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just watched the front door. Waiting. Across town, in room 6, Emily Bennett sat, beside her son's bed, spinning her wedding ring in slow circles. Brian had gone home for the night, worn down by a week of microwaved coffee and medical charts. The room felt wrong without Ranger. Even the nurses had noticed. It's quiet, one had murmured during rounds. Emily wasn't a superstitious woman, but she had eyes and ears. She saw how Ranger acted around her son, how he knew when something shifted. She turned to Nurse Caitlin Ross. What do you think he was trying to tell us? Caitlin hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. But I started writing it down. What? Ranger's behavior. Times, frequency, how long he stayed still when he barked. Just a few notes. Emily blinked. Like a log? Yeah, I've seen therapy dogs act sensitive before. But this is different. This feels like search and rescue. Emily didn't know it yet, but across the city Mike was doing the same thing. He had pulled Ranger's service logs from his rescue days, flipping through years of deployments, behavior patterns, training manuals. One case stood out. An earthquake. Mission in Baja California 5 years back. Ranger had refused to leave a collapsed orphanage for 2 straight days. Every other dog had cleared the site. No heat signatures. No signs of life. But Ranger had paced that rubble like he heard whispers underground. On day 3, they dug, just to settle the dog down, and they found a 6-year-old boy alive under a broken water heater. Ranger had felt the breathing, the tiny shift in air, the vibrations a human body made when clinging to the last string of life. Mike stared at the log in his hands. It was happening again. Back in the hospital, Dr. Marcus Halden had joined Noah's case. Young for a neurologist but known for thinking outside the box, he leaned over the EEG readings with a furrowed brow. Everything looks stable, he muttered. But what? Caitlin asked. These micro spikes. They're not enough to trigger alarms, but they're weird. Small bursts of irregular brainwave activity could be subclinical seizures. And that would mean? Windows. Brief windows of potential awareness. Moments when Noah might be trying to come up but doesn't have the strength. Caitlin's heart skipped. Could a dog sense that? Dr. Halden looked up slowly. Maybe, if it's consistent. If the timing matches. She pulled out the notes she'd kept. His eyes scanned them and stopped. You logged this? Yes. Ranger barked. Right here. She pointed. 3:02 a.m. Same time the ventilator spike occurred. He checked the EEG file again. No 2 a.m. Slight irregularity. Ventilator pressure drop. Heart rate fluctuation. It didn't prove anything, but it didn't prove nothing either. 2 floors below in the staff lounge, Nurse Caitlin made a call. Mike answered on the second ring. He's right, isn't he? She asked. Mike didn't. Ask who she meant. Yeah, he said quietly. He's trying to tell us something. I think you need to come back. They'll never let him in. Let me work on that, she replied. Emily stood at the garden courtyard window, staring at the sunset bleeding across the Texas sky. Ranger's t-shirt lay on the bed. She gently placed it back in Noah's hands. You miss him, don't you, buddy? She whispered. A tear slipped down her cheek. Suddenly a voice behind her. You volunteered with SAR, right? Emily turned. Caitlin was holding a folder. Inside. Ranger's training history. Mike dropped this off, she said. He thought you'd want to see it. Emily flipped through the pages. There. Her signature. 5 years ago. Volunteer coordinator. Southwest. K9 disaster program. I helped design his early alert command, she murmured. Before I got pregnant with Noah. The irony made her knees weak. She had helped train the dog who might now save her son. That night, Mike got a text from Emily. Come back tomorrow. Bring Ranger. I'll handle the rest. At 6:45 a.m., they arrived. Administrator Crowley was waiting. Didn't smile. But she didn't stop them either. We're allowing a 1-day supervised observation, she said flatly. This does not imply endorsement. Mike nodded. Ranger didn't need her blessing. He just needed to get back to the boy. When Ranger entered room 6, his body relaxed. He padded to Noah's bedside, sniffed the air, and gently rested his head on the boy's hand. Nothing dramatic. No barking. Just presence. Emily knelt beside them both, brushing her son's hair with one hand, scratching Ranger's ear with the other. Okay, big guy, she whispered. Show us what you know. Ranger blinked slowly, nose twitching. The machines hummed. The moment passed quietly. But something had shifted. Everyone felt it. Later that evening, Mike stood with Dr. Halden in the hallway, watching the feed from the EEG monitor now linked to an overhead camera tracking Ranger's movements. "Think we'll get anything tonight?" Mike asked. The neurologist hesitated. "If the patterns hold," he said. "It'll happen around 3 a.m. Mike nodded. "Ranger'll be ready." He turned to walk away. Halden said something almost too soft to hear. "I believe he already is." The clock on the ICU wall ticked past 2:59 a.m. Outside the Dallas Children's Medical Center, storm clouds pressed low against the city. The wind howled through the alleyways like a warning. A late summer thunderstorm had rolled in with all. The subtlety of a freight train. Lightning flashing across the windows of room 6, illuminating 8-year-old Noah Bennett's sleeping face in pale blue bursts. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Ranger was awake. The German Shepherd lay near the foot of Noah's hospital bed, his body rigid, nose twitching, eyes locked on the boy's chest as if he were reading a code the rest of the world couldn't see. At 3 a.m. Exactly, he stood. Nurse Caitlin Ross had just returned from her break, a steaming cup of burnt cafeteria coffee in hand when she saw it. Ranger's sudden shift from stillness to full alert. His ears perked. His posture tightened. His tail stood low but straight. "Something's happening," she said quietly. Mike Ramirez leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing. That's his alert stance. The EEG monitor in the corner blinked with steady lines, but Caitlin's gut told her to trust the dog. "I'm going to check Noah," she said. As she moved toward the bed, Ranger circled to the other side and barked once, sharp and low, a sound that sent goosebumps across her arms. The room held its breath. Emily Bennett sat up in the chair beside her son's bed, eyes wide, heart hammering. "What is it?" she asked, voice hoarse from sleep. Caitlin hesitated. "Ranger's reacting. Again. Same time as before." Noah's face remained still. The heart monitor pulsed a regular beat. Oxygen saturation held at 98%. But Ranger didn't budge. He climbed slowly, carefully placing his front paws on the mattress, standing over Noah's chest. He sniffed, then whined. "Mike," Caitlin said urgently. Mike approached, ready to give a command, but Ranger turned to him, eyes intense, ears forward, and gave 2 short barks. The same barks Mike had heard on a search site 5 years ago, seconds before they found a collapsed wall hiding a trapped girl. "Okay," he said, breath catching. "That's an urgent alert." He turned to Caitlin. "Check everything. Right now." Caitlin didn't argue. She leaned over Noah's ventilator. "Connection?" Then froze. "Damn it," she whispered. "The connector's loose again." She grabbed the tubing, inspecting the join between the endotracheal tube and the ventilator line. "It's slipping, just like before," she said. Emily gasped. "Is he getting air?" "Barely," Caitlin said, hands already moving. Another hour like this and he might have started losing oxygen again. Lightning flashed across the window. A rumble of thunder shook the glass. Mike reached down and pulled Ranger gently back. "You found it, buddy," he whispered. "You saw it again." The emergency tech team arrived minutes later, called in by Caitlin's rapid-fire code through the hallway intercom. The respiratory therapist confirmed her findings. "Tube was on the verge of a full disconnect," he said, shaking his head. "Good catch." Emily didn't respond. She just bent over her son and kissed his forehead. Tears falling freely now. "You're not alone, baby," she whispered. "Your dog is still watching." Later that morning, in the conference room outside the ICU, Dr. Marcus Halden stared at the EEG readout and the time-stamped behavior footage from Ranger. The timing lined up. Again. 3 nights, he said aloud. 3 nights in a row, Ranger alerts right as Noah's vitals shift or the equipment fails. That can't be coincidence anymore. Dr. Linda Crowley sat across the table, arms folded, skepticism etched deep into her features. "Correlation doesn't equal causation," she said. "We still don't know what, if anything, the dog is reacting to." Dr. Halden's eyes narrowed. If that ventilator had slipped entirely and no one caught it, Noah could have coded. Do we really want to risk ignoring what this dog is clearly perceiving? Crowley hesitated. I'm not against animals, she said finally, but medicine is built on repeatable, measurable evidence, not instinct. Maybe it's time we expand our measurements, Halden replied, tapping the EEG chart, because the dog's batting 1,000. Mike returned home that evening exhausted, Ranger trailing behind him. The storm had cleared, leaving the Dallas streets wet and gleaming under the street lamps. But a different kind of energy was buzzing in Mike's mind. Anticipation, anxiety, validation. He placed Ranger's service vest on the hallway hook and poured a bowl of kibble into his dish. To his surprise, Ranger ate. That's new, Mike said aloud, watching the dog scarf down the food with the focus of a soldier refueling before battle. He knelt beside him, stroking the back of his neck. You feel better now, huh? You showed them you were right. Ranger looked up at him and wagged his tail once. The next morning, Dr. Halden approached Emily and Brian Bennett with a new idea. We want to place additional sensors in the room, he said. Cameras, pressure monitors, environmental sensors. If Ranger reacts again, we want to capture every possible metric. Will it help him? Emily asked. I don't know, Halden admitted, but I think it'll help us understand what the dog is seeing that we're not. Brian exchanged a look with his wife. Do it. By midnight, Room 6 looked like a command center. Cameras recorded from 4 angles. EEG readings were streamed to a remote server. Pressure sensors were mounted beneath the mattress. Even Ranger had been fitted with a lightweight movement tracker to log every bark, tail movement, and pacing interval. Dr. Halden sat in an observation bay with a neurology resident and a cup of strong black coffee. Mike and Ranger sat in their usual spot. Emily rested her head against Noah's mattress. One hand gripping her son's fingers, the other loosely resting on Ranger's back. Everyone was waiting for 3:00 a.m. At 2:58, Ranger stirred. He sat up, tail still, eyes locked on Noah. Then slowly, he stood. Everyone watching leaned forward. Here we go, Mike said softly. Ranger padded to Noah's side and gave a low, deliberate whine. Record that, Halden said to the technician. One paw lifted, then the other. He placed both front paws on the mattress. No bark yet, Mike whispered. He's close, but not urgent. Dr. Halden glanced at the EEG. Noah's brainwaves just shifted, he said quickly. Temporal lobe activity is spiking higher than baseline. Ranger lowered his nose, sniffing along Noah's arm, then stopped at the boy's chest. Suddenly, he barked. Once. Then again. Short. Sharp. Controlled. Emily gasped. Noah's fingers moved, she whispered. Mike rushed forward, watching as Noah's hand gave the slightest tremble. The EEG spiked. He's reacting, the resident said breathlessly. There's definite movement. We have pupillary response. Ranger barked again, then sat down beside the bed, tail wagging slowly. The monitor showed another brief spike. Then, stillness. But the silence was different now. It was full of hope. Sunrise, the story had spread across the floor. Staff whispered in hallways. Nurses exchanged knowing looks. Even Dr. Crowley stopped by room 6, looked at Ranger and gave a single curt nod. Something like respect. Mike stood in the hospital courtyard later that morning, staring at the pale orange glow rising over the horizon. Ranger sat beside him, alert but relaxed. They're listening now, Mike said softly. Took 'em long enough. He looked down at his partner. But you never needed them to believe, did you? You just kept showing up. Ranger's eyes met his, unwavering, faithful, unbreakable. The knock on the Bennett family waiting room door was soft, but it shattered, the silence like a thunderclap. Emily looked up from the blanket in her lap, eyes rimmed red, dark circles blooming beneath them. Brian stirred from the uncomfortable couch, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The clock said 9:17 a.m., but it could have been any hour. Time meant nothing here. The door opened. Dr. Marcus Halden stepped in, clutching a tablet and 2 cups of coffee. We've got some things to go over, he said gently. They knew that tone, the we have to talk tone, the I know you haven't slept but here's more bad news tone. Emily's stomach sank. Down the hall in room 6, Ranger lay curled on the tile floor, head between his paws, eyes flicking toward the hallway every few minutes. Mike sat beside him, laptop open, reviewing overnight logs. Noah hadn't moved again since the previous night's tremor. The EEG spikes had dropped off after the brief episode, and yet there was a feeling in the air, like they were standing on a cliff's edge waiting for something to break. Back in the family room, Dr. Halden pulled up Noah's most recent EEG data. "You saw what happened last night?" he began. "The spike, the movement, the pupillary response." Emily nodded. Brian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That was hopeful," Halden said. "But it also raised more questions. We need to talk about what's causing these spikes." Emily gripped her coffee cup tighter. "Go on." "We suspect subclinical seizure activity. Small, silent seizures. No outward symptoms unless you're tracking brain waves second by second. That might explain the twitching, the micro-responses. His brain could be firing in isolated regions, which occasionally breaks through the coma wall." Brian frowned. "And that's bad?" "It's complicated," Halden admitted. "It means parts of Noah's brain are still trying, but it also suggests something might be wrong structurally, something we didn't catch before." He paused, then said the words they'd feared for days. "We're recommending an enhanced MRI." 2 hours later, Noah was wheeled down for the scan. Emily walked beside the gurney in silence, her hand wrapped around his tiny fingers, her heart beating out a prayer she couldn't find words for. Ranger wasn't allowed in the MRI suite, so he sat in the hallway outside, tail flicking impatiently, head turned toward the double doors. He didn't like being separated. Mike could see it in the dog's posture, the low whine, the repeated pacing. It was like he sensed something, brewing just out of reach. "You'll see him soon, bud," Mike murmured, placing a reassuring hand on his back. But Ranger didn't relax. When the scan ended, they all gathered again, this time in a glass-walled consultation room that overlooked the playground below. Dr. Halden stood beside the light board, black and white, MRI images glowing behind him. He pointed to a dark mass near the lower section of Noah's brainstem. "This wasn't visible in the earlier scans," he said quietly, "but it's there now. A small hematoma, likely post-traumatic, possibly growing slowly." Emily's knees buckled slightly. Brian reached to steady her. "Is it operable?" she asked. A pause. "Possibly," Halden said. "But it's in a delicate location. Surgery comes with serious risks, mobility, cognition, speech, and if we do nothing, the pressure may increase." Emily swallowed hard. "So either way, we're gambling." "Yes," he said, "but now we at least know what we're dealing with." They returned to room 6 in silence. Ranger stood the moment they entered, tail wagging slightly, but his ears stayed back, concern written all over his expressive face. Emily knelt beside him, running a hand over his thick fur. "They found something," she whispered. "You knew, didn't you?" Ranger leaned his head against her shoulder, and for a moment it didn't feel like a therapy visit. It felt like family. That evening, Mike and Emily sat alone on a bench outside the hospital cafeteria, 2 paper coffee cups between them, both long cold. "You trained him, didn't you?" Mike asked. Emily nodded. "A lifetime ago, when I volunteered with the Southwest Search and Rescue Program. Before I had Noah." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Small world." Emily offered a faint smile. "I helped design early alert communication drills, back when we thought dogs could teach us how to listen better. Funny how life circles back." "He still uses them," Mike said. "He's been signaling all week. We just didn't know how to read him." Emily stared at the ground for a moment, then she whispered, "What if we had?" The next day, a storm began to build again, not outside, but inside the hospital. Tension rolled through the staff. The neurosurgical team had reviewed the MRI. They wanted to operate. Dr. Linda Crowley, always the voice of clinical authority, pulled. the family into a private room and laid it out in firm, practiced terms. The bleeding could accelerate. We need to relieve the pressure. Waiting too long risks permanent damage. Brian and Emily sat frozen. What are his chances? Brian asked. Crowley didn't answer right away. We don't talk in absolutes, she said. But it's a risky surgery. There's no easy way through this. Brian clenched his fists. Emily bit back tears. And through the window, Ranger sat, nose pressed to the glass, watching. Later that night, Mike tried to take Ranger home. The dog refused. Every time he tugged the leash, Ranger dug in harder, paws splayed on the tile, eyes locked on Noah's bed. He doesn't want to leave, Mike said, half laughing, half worried. Emily approached with Noah's t-shirt. Let me try, she said. She knelt beside him, held out the shirt, and spoke gently. You have to rest too, okay? Just for a bit. We need you to be ready. Ranger sniffed the shirt, then whined, but finally stood, slowly padding toward the door. Before he exited, he glanced back one last time. At Mike's home, Ranger paced. He refused food. He sat by the door for hours, eyes focused on the horizon, as if waiting for the moment he'd be needed again. Mike watched him with growing concern. You've never done this before, he muttered, even on the worst missions. The next morning at 5:13 a.m., his phone rang. It was Nurse Caitlin. They're prepping Noah for surgery, she said. But that's not why I'm calling. Mike sat up straighter. Dr. Halden reviewed all of Ranger's logs, the EEGs, the behavioral tags, the video footage. He thinks Ranger isn't just sensing seizures. What then? He thinks Ranger is detecting Noah's moments of near consciousness. The spikes align almost perfectly with when Ranger gets agitated. Not after, not during, but before. Mike's throat tightened. That's incredible. That's why I'm calling. Dr. Halden wants Ranger back, not just in the hospital, in the OR prep suite. Back at the hospital, as Noah was wheeled toward surgery, a small crowd of nurses and techs paused in the hallway as Ranger walked beside the gurney. Head held high, tail low and steady, like a soldier escorting a general. Emily walked on the other side, holding Noah's hand. Ranger kept glancing at the boy's face, his movements measured, his eyes alert. As they reached the OR doors, a surgical assistant held out a sterile pad. He can't come in, she said softly. Emily turned to Ranger, dropped to one knee, and whispered in his ear, Wait here, guard this spot. You'll see him again soon. Ranger sat down immediately right outside the OR, his eyes locked on the door, unmoving. Just like he had during rescues, just like he had with trapped children, just like he was trained to do. The overhead surgical lights flickered once, then settled into their steady white hum. Inside Operating Room 4 of Dallas Children's Medical Center, a team of neurosurgeons worked in silence, voices calm and precise, hands steady despite the storm that raged in the minds of everyone who had come to love Noah Bennett. Dr. Patel, the lead neurosurgeon, peered through the microscope. Beginning the craniotomy, he said evenly. Outside, in the OR prep hallway, Ranger sat completely still. For nearly an hour, he didn't move. He didn't bark. He didn't shift his paws. He just watched the operating room doors, waiting. Emily sat curled on a plastic chair in the surgical waiting area, fingers clenching a rosary, though she hadn't been to church in years. Brian stood with one hand pressed against the window, staring at the sky. The morning sun was rising, but it felt like midnight inside their hearts. I keep thinking about how he barked when the tube came loose, Emily whispered. Brian looked over. I know. And how he wouldn't eat. How he just knew. Brian walked back and sat beside her, elbows on his knees. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't seen it. Yeah, Emily murmured. It's more than instinct. It's devotion. They sat in silence for a while. Then Brian said something he hadn't voiced since the day of the accident. What if we lose him? Emily didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, We've already almost lost him. But Ranger wouldn't let that happen. Her voice cracked. So maybe we just trust him a little longer. At 7:32 a.m., the double doors of the OR burst open. Dr. Patel stepped out, still in surgical cap and gown, exhaustion carved deep into the lines of his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," he said, approaching them. Emily rose, heart frozen. "The surgery went as expected," he said. "We removed the hematoma successfully. The pressure on the brainstem has been relieved." Emily clutched Brian's arm, trying to process it. "That's good?" she asked hesitantly. "It's promising," Dr. Patel said with careful optimism. "But the next 48 hours are critical. He's still in a coma, and we won't know the long-term neurological impact until he begins to regain consciousness." He paused. "If he does." They brought Noah back to room 6 later that morning. The moment the gurney appeared at the end of the hallway, Ranger stood up. He didn't bark. He didn't pull on the leash. He just walked calmly beside the bed as if he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. Nurses watched with awe. Some whispered prayers. When they reached the room, Ranger sat down beside the bed and let out a single sigh, like he had just exhaled a burden no one else could carry. The days blurred. Emily and Brian took shifts sleeping in the reclining chair. Mike stayed nearby with Ranger, walking him, feeding him, monitoring his every move. Nurse Caitlin never missed a round. Dr. Halden came in every few hours, checking EEG results, monitoring reflexes, watching for anything. Nothing. No movement. No spikes. No changes. The silence grew heavy. Hope started to fray. On the third night after surgery, Emily stepped outside into the courtyard, wrapping a cardigan tightly around her shoulders. The September air had finally begun to cool, and for the first time in weeks, the Texas heat had lifted. She sat on the edge of a stone bench, staring up at the stars. She didn't hear Mike approach until he sat down beside her. "How's he doing?" she asked. "About the same," Mike replied. "Vitals are stable. Ranger's been glued to his side since the gurney rolled in." Emily nodded, eyes glistening. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "You've worked with dogs your whole life. Rescue missions, war zones, earthquakes. What do you really think is going on with him?" Mike stared at the sky for a long time before answering. "Some dogs," he said slowly. "They're born with something extra, a deeper sense. It's not just training or smell or reflex. It's this connection. It's like they feel things we've forgotten how to feel." He turned to her. Ranger didn't pick Noah by chance. He remembered him from that school demo, sure, but this is something else. He's trying to reach him, not just protect him. Emily wiped her eyes. "I believe that," Mike added. "When we did earthquake rescues, Ranger would scratch and whine when someone was buried alive. But once they were found, he'd stop. He could tell when someone had given up, and when someone hadn't." Emily whispered, "So you think Noah hasn't given up?" Mike nodded. "Ranger hasn't, either." That night, room 6 was calm. Emily and Brian had both fallen asleep. Ranger lay beside the bed, his body still but alert. His eyes were fixed on Noah, watching every breath, every twitch, every vibration. The clock struck 3 a.m. Ranger's ears perked. He stood, and something changed. He paced once, then placed both front paws carefully on the bed's edge, peering at Noah's face. A low whine escaped him. He sniffed Noah's arm, then moved to the chest. Then, he barked. Short, urgent, focused. Mike sat up straight. "Something's happening," he said. Caitlin, who had been checking logs at the nurse's station, rushed in. "Vitals?" she asked. "O2 is stable. Heart rate is slightly elevated." Then Emily stirred, blinking awake just in time to hear a sound. A breath, a hitch in Noah's throat. She leaned in. "Noah," she whispered. And then, his eyelids fluttered. Everyone froze. "Noah," Emily repeated louder this time. A flicker. Then, his eyes opened, not wide, not clear, but open, and they moved. They tracked. They found her face. "Noah!" she cried. Brian rushed to her side, disbelief written across every line of his face. And then, Noah's lips moved. Barely a whisper. A sound without volume, but everyone heard it. Ra-ger. The room broke. Caitlin pressed the intercom for a code white. Patient responsive after coma. Mike dropped to one knee beside Ranger, wrapping his arms around the dog's broad shoulders. You did it, buddy, he choked out. You brought him back. Ranger's tail wagged, once, then twice. Then he sat down and rested his head on Noah's mattress, eyes soft, breathing steady. Dr. Halden arrived minutes later, breathless, stethoscope swinging from his neck. He checked reflexes, asked Noah to blink, squeeze, follow a light. Minimal responses, but they were there. He's waking up, the doctor confirmed. This isn't a random twitch, he's here. Tears ran freely down Emily's face. Brian bent low and kissed Noah's forehead. Outside the room, a small crowd of staff had gathered, drawn by the code, by the whispers, by the miracle. Some had laughed at the idea that a dog could see what they couldn't. Not anymore. Hours later, as the sun rose again over the Dallas skyline, Mike sat in the courtyard with Ranger beside him. He scratched the dog's head and said, "They're gonna want to study you now? Give you a name badge, put you in a textbook." Ranger yawned. Mike smiled. "But we know the truth, don't we?" Ranger leaned into him, eyes closed, body finally at rest. For now. The sun filtered gently through the window blinds of room 6, casting long, golden lines across the floor where Ranger lay sleeping, his body curled against the side of the hospital bed, one paw resting lightly on the blanket draped over Noah Bennett. No machine screamed, no alarms flashed, just the soft, steady beeping of a heart monitor and the rhythmic sound of a child breathing on his own. After 18 days in a coma, Noah was awake. The recovery wasn't cinematic. There were no dramatic leaps from bed, no sudden full sentences or tearful "I love you, Mom." Progress came slowly, like a sunrise inching over the edge of the earth. Noah blinked, tracked movement, gripped his mother's finger, tried to speak. He'd whisper a syllable, then sleep for hours. But every time he opened his eyes, they looked for one thing. Ranger. Doctors rotated in and out of room 6 like clockwork. Specialists, therapists, neurosurgeons, each bringing cautious optimism, wrapped in clinical language. He's showing consistent neural activity. Motor responses remain intact. Language centers may be temporarily delayed, but none of them could explain why the boy's eyes followed a dog more closely than any screen or sensor. Ranger wasn't just a comfort animal anymore. He was something else. By the end of the first week post-surgery, Noah could speak a little. Simple words. Yes. No. Mom. Dad. And one name, Ranger, which he said more clearly than any other. In the hallway outside, Dr. Marcus Halden gave a press briefing, flanked by hospital administrators, including a newly humbled Dr. Linda Crowley. "We don't yet understand all the science behind what happened here," Halden told the cameras, "but what we do understand is this. Ranger, a trained search and rescue dog turned therapy animal, consistently identified changes in Noah Bennett's condition before our machines could." He glanced at Ranger, who sat calmly at Mike's side wearing his service vest and a new collar tag, engraved with one word, Guardian. "We plan to study this connection further," Halden continued. "And we encourage the medical community to reconsider how animal perception can complement our current diagnostics. Because sometimes," he paused, "the heart knows what data doesn't." The next day, the hospital renamed the pediatric Courtyard Ranger's Garden. In the weeks that followed, Noah's recovery became something of a local legend. A therapy dog that had refused to leave. A boy who had defied the odds. A family that had nearly fallen apart, only to be knit together, again by pause and patience. Emily and Brian walked the halls hand in hand now, no longer silent strangers passing in grief. They had rediscovered each other somewhere in the quiet moments of waiting and watching their son come back. And always, just behind them, was Ranger. One afternoon, as Noah sat in a wheelchair watching squirrels in Ranger's garden, he turned to his mom, Did he really wait the whole time? Emily knelt beside him. Every second, Noah looked at Ranger. The German shepherd, as if understanding the moment, stood up and placed his head gently in the boy's lap. Noah laughed, light and musical and entirely alive. "Good boy," he whispered, stroking the dog's ears. "Best boy ever." Mike Ramirez knew it was almost time to say goodbye. Ranger had been cleared to return to therapy work. Dozens of families were requesting sessions. His story had gone viral. Kids in other wards made signs with paw prints and messages, like, "We love you, Ranger." But Mike also knew something else. Ranger was getting older. Not in body. He was still strong and focused, but in spirit. He had found something in Noah that went deeper than any mission. A bond. A calling. One crisp October morning, Mike stood beside Emily and Brian just outside the hospital chapel. "I've been thinking," he said, clearing his throat, "about what comes next." Emily raised an eyebrow. Mike reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ear. "He's done his duty, more than any dog I've ever handled. But lately, I think he's telling me he wants to stay." Brian blinked. "You mean, I want to offer you the chance to adopt him," Mike said, "if you're open to it." Emily covered her mouth, tears springing instantly to her eyes. "You'd do that?" Mike smiled. "He chose you. I'm just honoring the decision." Noah, seated in his chair beside them, whispered, "He already lives here in my heart." The adoption paperwork was signed that afternoon. Ranger got a new tag and a new bed, right at the foot of Noah's. The night Ranger came home, Noah was able to climb into bed without help for the first time. He looked over at the dog curled on the rug beside him and whispered, "You saved me, huh?" Ranger lifted his head, ears flicking forward. Noah smiled. "I'm going to be just like you one day." And with that, he drifted off to sleep, safe, warm, and watched over. A month later, the story aired nationally. The segment ran on morning news shows and talk programs across the country. The dog who wouldn't leave, clips of Ranger beside, the hospital bed, interviews with Dr. Halden and Nurse Caitlin, a shot of Noah running across the grass, Ranger bounding beside him, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. The final quote came from Emily. "When machines didn't know, when doctors weren't sure, Ranger stood his ground. He reminded us that love doesn't wait for permission, it just stays." Back in Ranger's garden, a small bronze plaque was installed beside the shaded bench where Noah and Ranger often sat together. It read, "For the dog who waited, and the boy who came back." Now, if you visit the hospital, you might see them. Noah, still growing stronger, and Ranger, now semi-retired, lying in the sun as if he owns the place, which in a way he does. And when kids walk by and ask, "Is that the dog from the story?" Noah just nods and says, "Yeah, that's him." And then he adds with a grin, "He's my dog now." Thank you so much for following Ranger and Noah's story. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever known a dog or any animal that seemed to understand more than you expected? Do you believe animals can sense things we can't? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more true stories that celebrate the animals who protect, heal, and inspire us every day. Until next time, stay kind. And always, always trust the ones who never leave your side.